The world was burning. Cities crumbled, skies blackened with smoke, and the earth itself seemed to shiver under the relentless march of war. Japan, once proud and unyielding, was on the brink of collapse. The bombs fell from the heavens like judgment itself, and in the chaos, an unseen war raged. One fought not with guns, but in the silence of homes, streets, and shattered hearts. Among the ruins, the women of Japan moved like ghosts, navigating a world that had turned against them. Their lives were no longer their own. The cities they had once walked freely became cages, their safety illusions shattered by the sounds of explosions, sirens, and the cries of those who had fallen before them. Mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, all were caught in a web woven by a war they never asked for. The beginning of the end was not sudden. It crept like a shadow, stretching across every town, every home. Early in the war, Japanese women were told to be strong, to carry the weight of a nation's pride even as young men were sent to die on distant shores. Propaganda filled the airwaves and newspapers. Protect your homeland, endure, sacrifice. Yet the truth was far darker. As the Allied bombings intensified, the streets emptied. Markets were gone, schools abandoned, and houses reduced to splinters. But in the quiet of these ruins, a different kind of terror emerged. Women were forced to confront hunger, illness, and violence in a society that had broken down. Food lines became battlegrounds. Desperation twisted human behavior into cruelty. Neighbors turned on neighbors. And yet, through it all, the women carried on, driven by a mix of instinct, fear, and an unyielding will to survive. In the cities that had been spared the worst of the bombings, the arrival of soldiers, first Japanese, then Allied, brought a new kind of darkness. The law of the land had faltered. Protection was gone. Women were exposed to abuses that the history books often ignore. The whispers of what happened behind closed doors were drowned by the roar of the war, yet they left marks invisible to the naked eye, scars that would haunt generations. In Tokyo, Kyoto, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, the days bled into nights with no reprieve. Every shadow could hide danger. Every stranger could carry threat. Families huddled together in cramped shelters, sharing what little food remained. Women tended to children while listening to the distant sounds of destruction, praying that the world outside would not invade the fragile sanctuary they tried to maintain. And then the end came. August 1945. The atomic bombs fell, reducing Hiroshima and Nagasaki to ash and memory. The war Japan had waged across Asia was finally over, but for its women, the aftermath was only beginning. The surrender did not bring safety, it brought occupation. The Allies entered a country still reeling, and the rules had changed. The power dynamics that had oppressed women for decades now collided with foreign soldiers in a landscape of devastation. The Japanese women faced new challenges, more insidious than the bombings. Reports of harassment, intimidation, and violence emerged almost immediately. Men who had survived the war looked to reassert dominance. Others, foreign troops unfamiliar with local culture, acted with disregard for the lives they entered. The women, already worn thin by years of deprivation and fear, now navigated a world where every step could bring humiliation or worse. Yet, it was not only physical survival that defined this period, it was the struggle for dignity. In villages and cities, women became the backbone of what remained of Japanese society. They scavenged food, rebuilt homes, and protected children from the horrors that lingered in the streets. The courage required to endure was immense, yet almost invisible. The history books, obsessed with generals and battles, seldom acknowledged the battles fought silently by women who had survived the war itself. There were stories, whispered at first, then written in private diaries, of women who refused to bow to fear. One mother, separated from her husband in the bombings, carried her 2 children through the rubble to find shelter, ignoring the bombs that still fell around them. Another young woman, trapped in a city that had surrendered, stood her ground when looters attempted to invade her home, brandishing a kitchen knife with the ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Some women were less fortunate. Many were forced into situations where their bodies became the last battlefield, where survival was measured in endurance rather than victory. Yet even here, strength endured, not the kind measured by weapons or armies, but the quiet, relentless kind that allowed them to wake each morning, to care for the next generation, and to refuse the world's cruelty entirely. The post-war years brought reconstruction, but the scars remained. The women of Japan carried the memories of fear, hunger, and loss into a society eager to move on. Those who spoke of what they endured were often dismissed, silenced, or forgotten. The shame, imposed by a society desperate to reclaim pride, weighed heavily on those who had survived. They walked through cities being rebuilt, ghosts in plain sight, their histories buried beneath concrete and propaganda. Yet history cannot be erased. In the quiet corners of libraries, in faded photographs, and in the diaries left behind, the stories survive. They tell of mothers who scavenged for rice, daughters who learned to read in candlelight while bombs fell outside, women who confronted invading forces with nothing but courage and defiance. These are not tales of heroes in uniforms or generals giving orders. These are tales of survival, of endurance, of raw humanity. Some accounts remain almost unbelievable in their intensity. A grandmother who had witnessed the firebombing of Tokyo would later tell her grandchildren how she led a group of women through the streets, avoiding soldiers and rubble alike, until they reached a shelter. She described the quiet, terrifying moments when Allied planes would fly overhead, and the women would lie flat, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Her hands shook not from age but from memory. Memory of a city turned into ashes and of nights when the screams of strangers became the soundtrack of life. Other stories are tinged with anger and rebellion. Women who had lost family members refused to leave the ruins of their homes, declaring that the land itself belonged to them, even as occupiers attempted to claim authority. Some organized communities, negotiated with soldiers, and protected the young from the harshness of both war and peace. In these small, defiant acts, the seeds of modern resilience were planted. By the time the 1950s arrived, Japan had begun its remarkable recovery. Cities rose from rubble, factories churned, and the nation projected an image of order and prosperity. But beneath the surface, the women who had survived the war carried invisible loads. Trauma, grief, and memories of violence did not vanish with reconstruction. Many married, had children, and contributed to society, yet the shadows of the past lingered, silent, ever present, unacknowledged. Some dared to speak, slowly and cautiously. Memoirs, interviews, and historical investigations revealed the depth of suffering and endurance. The world began to understand the layers of what had been endured. Yet still, much remained hidden. The stories of Japanese women were often overshadowed by tales of battles, strategy, and political negotiations. The true cost of the war, measured in the quiet endurance of women, had almost been lost to time. And this is why the history of Japanese women during WW2 matters. It is not simply a story of suffering, though suffering was abundant. It is a story of resilience, defiance, and an unyielding spirit. It is a reminder that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield. Cities may fall, armies may surrender, nations may rebuild, but the endurance of women, their courage, their capacity to survive and protect, persists as a silent testament to humanity. As we look back, it is impossible to ignore the shadows they carried. The ash of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not the only thing that remained. So too did the weight of memories, the quiet grief, and the silent defiance. The women who lived through this era did so against overwhelming odds, often unseen, uncelebrated, and unrecognized. Their stories, however, continue to echo through time, waiting for those willing to listen, to remember, and to honor their resilience. In the end, the tale of Japanese women during and after WW2 is not merely about suffering. It is about survival in the face of annihilation, courage in the absence of recognition, and strength that defies understanding. It is a testament to the human spirit, fierce, unbroken, and unrelenting. These women walked through fire and shadow, and though the world may have tried to forget them, their legacy endures, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity persists in the quietest of forms. The silence they carried was not weakness. It was endurance. It was defiance. It was a statement that the human spirit, even when battered by war, refuses to break. And in their stories, we find the raw, unfiltered truth of what it means to survive, to live, to endure, and to remember. The world will always remember the bombs, the generals, the treaties, but let us also remember the women, the mothers, the daughters, the survivors, who lived through history's cruelest moments, who bore the shadows so that the next generation could see the light. Their courage was quiet, but it was fierce. Their suffering was immense, but it was endured. Their story is the story of humanity itself, seen through the eyes of those who walked through fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken.